At 3:42 in the morning on April 18, 1943, the air inside the communications bunker at Rabaul East Airfield tasted like wet ash and ozone. It was a heavy, suffocating humidity that clung to human skin and rusted steel within hours. In the corner of this concrete tomb, Corporal Kenji Sato sat hunched over a workbench, his face illuminated only by the orange glow of a vacuum tube. He was 22 years old, a radio operator who had not slept in 30 hours. His hands were covered in grease and small cuts, shaking slightly from a mix of malaria fever and caffeine. He was doing something forbidden. With a pair of rusted pliers, Kenji was stripping the rubber insulation off a length of discarded copper wire he had scavenged from a broken generator behind the mess hall. It was a piece of trash, a scrap of metal that should have been buried in the mud. But to Kenji, in this specific moment, it was the only thing that mattered. Outside the thick concrete walls, the tropical night was alive with the sound of engines warming up. The ground crew was prepping 12 Zero fighters for a dawn patrol. Kenji stopped stripping the wire and looked at the silent, static-filled face of his wireless set. He did not know that 300 miles away, 16 American P-38 Lightnings were already airborne, hunting for the very planes warming up outside his door. Kenji had not joined the war to be a hero. He had joined because he loved machines. Growing up in a small fishing village near Osaka, he had been fascinated by the miracle of radio waves, the idea that a human voice could travel through the air and be heard across the ocean. When the Navy recruiters came, they promised him the finest equipment in the world. They told him that the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed technology that rivaled the West, built with the precision of a watch and the spirit of a sword. He was trained to operate the Type 99 Mark III wireless set. In the classroom, it was a beautiful device. It was encased in a sturdy metal box, filled with delicate glass valves and intricate wiring. It was designed to keep the vast empire connected, from the home islands to the furthest outposts in the South Pacific. The instructors taught him that the radio was the nervous system of the fleet. Without it, the planes were just blind birds. Without it, the ships were deaf. Kenji believed them. He polished the dials of his radio set every morning. He memorized the schematics until he could draw them with his eyes closed. The pilots shared this faith. They were modern samurai, but they trusted their technology implicitly. Before every flight, the squadron leader would nod to Kenji as he walked to his plane. It was a gesture of trust. It meant that they believed Kenji would be there. If they got lost in a storm, he would guide them home. If they found the enemy, he would relay their victory. If they were ambushed, he would warn them. They climbed into their cockpits with the rising sun on their wings, believing in the myth of perfection. They believed that the machine worked because it was Japanese. They believed that their fighting spirit could overcome any mechanical limitation. But spirit could not change the laws of physics. The Type 99 radio was designed for the dry, temperate climate of Japan. It was never meant to survive the rotting, boiling jungles of New Britain. The pilots saw the polished exterior of the radio set and saw strength. Kenji looked inside the casing and saw a tragedy waiting to happen. The truth was hidden in the moisture. Rabaul was not just an airfield. It was a swamp disguised as a military base. The humidity here was aggressive. It ate through leather boots in a week. It turned bread into green mold in a day. And inside the delicate electronics of the Type 99 radio, it was causing a slow, invisible catastrophe. For weeks, Kenji had watched the performance of his station degrade. The moisture seeped into the variable condensers. It created microscopic bridges of rust between the circuits. The result was a constant, maddening hiss of static. The technical term was a poor signal-to-noise ratio, but to Kenji, it sounded like the ocean drowning out the voices of his friends. 7 days ago, the consequences of this failure had become real. A flight of 3 Zeros had been sent out on a reconnaissance mission near Bougainville. A squall line had moved in rapidly, a towering wall of black clouds that swallowed the horizon. The flight leader had radioed for a vector home. Kenji had heard the faint, ghostly click of the transmission, but it was buried under a mountain of static interference. He had screamed into his microphone, trying to guide them back, trying to tell them to climb above the weather. There was no reply, just the white noise. 3 hours later, the fuel ran out. The planes never returned. They simply vanished into the sea, lost because a radio set could not cut through the atmospheric interference. The official report blamed the pilot's navigation error. The commanding officer had looked at Kenji with cold eyes and told him to pay more attention to his dials. He accused Kenji of sleeping on duty. He accused him of lacking focus. But it was not a lack of focus. It was a systemic failure. The standard-issue dipole antenna was barely adequate in perfect conditions. In this jungle hell, with the damp ground absorbing the signal, it was useless. The system was broken, but the Navy refused to admit flaws. To suggest the equipment was inadequate was to insult the engineers who designed it. It was safer to blame the operator. So Kenji sat in his bunker, listening to the hiss, knowing that the same static was waiting to kill the squadron launching this morning. The Americans had better radar. They had better radios. And if Kenji did not fix this, the pilots would be flying blind and deaf into a trap. The realization had come to him in a moment of frustration. Yesterday, while trying to tune the receiver during a routine check, Kenji had accidentally touched the grounding terminal with his bare hand while holding a metal wrench. The static had suddenly dropped. The voice from the Tokyo broadcast had jumped out, clear and sharp. His body, acting as an extension of the ground, had filtered out the interference. He realized immediately that the problem was the grounding system. The volcanic soil of Rabaul was too porous. It was a terrible electrical conductor. The radio was essentially floating electrically, picking up every stray atmospheric crackle and engine spark. To fix it, he needed to create a counterpoise, a web of metal to create an artificial ground that would stabilize the signal. But the manual was explicit. Field modifications to Imperial property were strictly prohibited. Tampering with the internal wiring of a Type 99 set was a court-martial offense. A radio operator was a button pusher, not an engineer. He was supposed to follow orders, not invent solutions. If an officer walked in and saw him splicing wires into the back of the receiver, Kenji could be arrested for sabotage. Defacing the Emperor's property was treason. He looked at the clock on the wall. For 10 in the morning. The engines outside were roaring to life. The propellers were chopping the humid air, getting ready to taxi. He had 20 minutes before they were out of range. 20 minutes before 12 men flew into a sky that might already be filled with Americans. Kenji looked at his hands. He looked at the scrap copper wire on the bench. He thought of the flight leader, Lieutenant Tanaka, who had given him a cigarette yesterday. Tanaka had a wife back in Hiroshima and a newborn daughter he had never seen. Kenji made his choice. He grabbed the wire cutters. He moved with a desperate, frantic energy. He bypassed the standard grounding post. He twisted the scavenged copper wire into a chaotic, spiral loop, forcing it into the back of the chassis. The hot soldering iron hissed as he melted lead onto the connection. The smell of burning flux filled the small room, masking the scent of mold. He burned his thumb on the hot metal, but he did not stop. He ran the other end of the wire to a steel water pipe that ran deep into the bunker's floor, scraping away the rust to ensure a clean contact. It was ugly. It looked like a rat's nest of metal. It violated every protocol in the Naval Handbook. It was a jury-rigged, amateur solution made of trash. But as he soldered the final connection, the needle on the signal strength meter jumped. The static hiss in his headphones receded like a tide going out. For the first time in months, the frequency was clear. The chaotic roar was replaced by a steady, rhythmic hum of the open airwaves. He had broken the law, but he had fixed the machine. The squadron was airborne. 12 Zeros climbed into the purple dawn, forming a tight V formation. They looked invincible against the rising sun, their Mitsubishi engines humming in perfect unison. But miles away, hiding in the cloud layers at 20,000 feet, 16 American P-38 Lightnings were waiting. The American trap was perfect. They had utilized superior radar to track the Japanese takeoff pattern. They were positioning themselves for a high-speed diving attack, the classic boom and zoom tactic that negated the Zero's agility. They would drop out of the sun, fire their heavy 50 caliber machine guns, and climb away before the Japanese pilots even knew they were under attack. It was a mathematical equation of death. The Zeros were flying straight and level, blind to the danger above them. In the damp bunker, Kenji pressed the headphones so hard against his ears that the hard plastic bruised his skin. The new copper loop was working beyond his wildest hopes. He could hear the faint, rhythmic hum of the squadron's carrier wave. But then, through the cleared static, he heard something else. It was a voice, speaking English. It was faint, bouncing off the ionosphere, but the sensitive copper wire caught it. Bandits at 4 o'clock low. Tally-ho. Dropping in 3. The Americans were communicating on an open channel. They were starting their dive. Kenji looked at the officer standing by the door. The officer was half asleep, leaning against the concrete frame, not wearing his headset. If Kenji spoke now, he would be breaking radio silence. Breaking silence without direct orders was a severe violation. It could give away their position to enemy listeners. It was grounds for immediate arrest. But the Americans already knew their position. The manual said silence. The reality said death. Kenji did not ask for permission. He flipped the transmit switch. The red light bathed his sweating face in a blood-colored glow. Tainan leader. Brake left. Brake left immediately. Enemy above. Brake left. His voice cracked with terror. He screamed it again, violating all code protocols. He did not use the call signs. He did not use the encrypted grid references. He just screamed raw, human panic into the machine. In the cockpit of the lead Zero, Lieutenant Tanaka was startled by the frantic voice exploding in his ears. It was not the calm, disciplined voice of a naval operator. It was a scream of absolute fear. But the urgency was undeniable. It cut through the complacency of the morning patrol. Instinct took over. Tanaka did not look. He slammed the control stick to the left. The entire formation, trained to follow his wingtips, banked hard in unison. 3 seconds later, the sky tore open. Tracers the size of fists ripped through the empty air where the Zeros had been moments ago. The P-38s roared past in a blur of silver, diving at 400 miles per hour. The sound of their passing was like a thunderclap. If the Zeros had been flying straight, half of them would have been balls of fire before they could touch their triggers. Because they had turned, the American pass missed. The ambush was blown. The Zeros, agile and light, whipped around on their wingtips. The hunter became the hunted. The sky turned into a swirling melee of dogfighting. Kenji listened to the chaos in his headset. He heard the grunt of pilots under G-force. He heard the chatter of machine guns. He heard the confirmation of a kill. Bandit down. I repeat, bandit down. The copper wire held. The connection remained clear. For 15 minutes, Kenji was the anchor for 12 men fighting for their lives. He relayed positions. He warned of flankers. He monitored the fuel status. He was no longer a corporal in a bunker. He was the 13th pilot, flying with them through the static, connected by a piece of scrap metal he had pulled from the trash. By 0600, the sky was quiet. The engines sputtered and popped as the planes returned to the runway. One by one, they touched down, their tires screeching against the crushed coral. 10 planes returned. 2 had been lost in the chaos of the dogfight, but 10 men climbed out of their cockpits alive. They had shot down 3 Americans. It was a tactical victory. A massacre had been averted. The pilots gathered on the tarmac, adrenaline still shaking their hands. They lit cigarettes and laughed loud, hysterical laughs, the sound of men who had cheated death. They slapped Lieutenant Tanaka on the back. That turn, they shouted. That turn saved us. How did you know? How did you see them coming out of the sun? Tanaka looked confused for a moment. He touched his leather flight helmet. The radio, he said, frowning slightly. Someone yelled. It didn't sound like the usual transmission, but the celebration swallowed his words. The sake was brought out. The ground crew cheered. The heroes were the men in the leather helmets and silk scarves. They were the ones who had pulled the triggers. Down in the damp bunker, the adrenaline faded, leaving Kenji shivering in the cold light of the morning. The door opened. The communications officer walked in. He looked fresh, his uniform crisp and starched, a stark contrast to the sweat-soaked operator. He looked at the radio set. He stopped. He saw the nest of copper wire twisted out of the back of the chassis. He saw the crude solder marks. He saw the water pipe connection running across the floor. What is this mess? The officer demanded, his face darkening. Kenji stood up, his legs weak. He snapped to attention. I modified the ground, sir, to clear the static. It allowed me to hear the American frequency. The officer did not listen to the explanation. He ripped the wire loose with a violent jerk. The solder snapped. You defaced Imperial equipment? You used trash to modify a Type 99 wireless set. He threw the copper wire onto the concrete floor. This is a disgrace. It looks like a rat's nest. If I report this to the mainland, you will be in the brig for a month. The officer kicked the wire into the corner. Clean this up. Restore it to regulation standards immediately. And write a report on why you broke radio silence without authorization. You are lucky we won today, Corporal, or you would be facing a firing squad for treason. The officer left, slamming the heavy steel door. Kenji stood alone in the humming silence of the bunker. He looked down at the copper wire. It was twisted and dirty. It lay among the dust and cigarette butts. He bent down and picked it up. The metal was still warm from the electrical current. 10 men were drinking sake outside because of this piece of trash. 10 families would get letters from their sons instead of telegrams from the Navy. He did not argue. He did not run after the pilots to claim his credit. He understood the machine of war. The machine did not care about the individual. It cared about order. He walked to the trash bin and dropped the wire inside. It made a small, metallic clink. The war rolled over Rabaul like a slow, crushing tide. The base was eventually bypassed by the Allies, left to starve and rot in the jungle as the front lines moved closer to Japan. The bunkers were abandoned. The radio sets were smashed or rusted into useless blocks of iron. Kenji Sato's name does not appear in the history books of the Pacific War. The official combat report for that day credits Lieutenant Tanaka with exceptional situational awareness and tactical brilliance. The copper wire decomposed in a landfill somewhere on the island, buried under layers of mud and time. But that morning proved a truth that is often forgotten in the worship of technology. Wars are fought with machines, but they are survived by human beings. Perfection is the enemy of survival. While the engineers in Tokyo demanded strict adherence to the manual, a 22-year-old boy used garbage to connect the sky to the earth. He proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon in a war is not a bomb, or a plane, or a battleship. Sometimes it is just a pair of pliers, a piece of scrap metal, and the courage to break the rules when the silence becomes too loud to bear. History is written by the victors, but memory is kept by the survivors. And somewhere, in the quiet years after the war, an old pilot might have looked at his grandchildren and wondered how, for one split second in 1943, a voice from the ground knew exactly when to tell him to turn.